Today on the Mr. Maple Show, winter is coming.
On today's episode, we'll be discussing what to do with Japanese maples during the winter, from protection from cold weather, planting and transplanting, repotting, watering, protecting from cold weather, and some of your favorite things about Japanese maples during the winter.
Hey guys, we've got a great show for you today. First off, make sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform. We're airing these on Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, so many different things. Find us on your favorite podcast platform. Rate us 5 stars. That goes a long way toward other people finding us. And as always, we air these episodes on Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern on our YouTube show. So if you want to watch us live, you can always get there in the chat. We have a great conversation going. We have a ton of regulars that get there in that chat on those premieres. We air videos every single day at 9 a.m. on our YouTube channel besides that Sunday premiere. I think we've got a good one for you today. Today we're going to be talking about winter is coming. We've got a lot of different conversations we can have about this. One of our most frequently asked questions is what to do with our Japanese maples in the winter.
And I think with winter approaching, this is such an important topic right now. I mean, we try to do things that are very relevant. And with winter approaching, winter is coming. I mean, this is the thing that a lot of people need right now in understanding what to do with their Japanese maples they need to do during the winter. Especially if you purchase some new Japanese maples from us and you're trying to figure out, hey, what do I do with these things during the winter? Hopefully this podcast will help you understand a little bit about what steps you need to take and how you should be growing your Japanese maples during those winter months.
Hey, one thing I'll let all you guys know up front, we do hold trees for spring, so if you're not comfortable with winter gardening, if you're in a heavy zone 5 and you want to hold that tree until spring, we have that option. There's a notes for seller part there on our website. So if you're purchasing specifically from MrMaple.com and you'd like a later ship date, you can always call and let Jody know. You need to do it pretty quickly because we do get things out pretty quickly, but there's also a notes for seller and you can add a later month there if you want to skip some of these winter steps. But we're going to go through some different winter steps for you. It's breaking it down a little bit. We're going to get into zone 5 and then zone 6 through 9. Japanese maples, as we always let people know, work zones 5 through 9. There's a few different steps in zone 5 than that 6 and 9 garden. 6 through 9 are a little bit easier.
Now, zones are broke down based on how cold you get during those winter months. The USDA has a whole website, and I've got a video that talks about what is your USDA gardening zone. You can go watch that video. You can go to the USDA website, plug in your zip code, and it will tell you what hardiness zone you are. So this can help you understand a little bit about what to do specifically in those different gardening zones. And if you're in a zone 5, you're in somewhere that gets down to like negative 20 degrees. That's negative 20 degrees during the winter. Mm-hmm. And if you do that, you're going to need to take extra steps than someone who's in a zone 6 where it gets down to negative 10. So let's just keep that in consideration. What we're talking about is how cold does it get in your zone, in your area during the winter months. That's what we're discussing when we're talking about these hardiness zones, zones 5, zone 6, zone 7, and zone 8, and zone 9.
Yeah, so basically in that zone 5, there's going to be a few more precautions, specifically in containers that we want you to consider. So when keeping Japanese maples in containers in zone 5, I often let people know the easiest step may be to go ahead and plant those. To get them in the ground, you're going to have less steps long term with a Japanese maple in the ground versus one in a pot. A lot of people will do things that are counterproductive for their own success. They'll say, well, I got this Japanese maple, it's November, I'm going to store this in my shed all winter instead of planting it, and they may even be in like a zone 8. And so I hear that more often than not. Someone's in like Atlanta, and they go, well, gosh, I got this, I heard spring's an easy time to plant. Maybe even got it in like September, and they'll hold that tree an entire year to plant it, and then they'll keep that tree like in a shed or something, even in a zone 8. And guys, 9 times out of 10, that's more harm than good. The container gardens are very easy for these zone 6 through 9 people. That's basically you're just going to need to protect during extreme changes. So during extreme changes, you're going to want to protect your trees in pots, zone 6 through 9. You're going to want to watch out. And there's polar vortexes. There's all kinds of crazy stuff that can happen. And I always tell people to be preemptive and prepare. But that zone 6 through 9 is going to be extremely easy for those container gardeners. Those zone 5 people are going to need to go to a shed, a garage, or inside. Now, there's factors to consider when you're doing that.
Now, if you're in the zones 5, remember that you do have to take extra steps when plants are in containers that other people don't have to take. I mean, zone 6 through 9, like Matt talked about, they can plant them directly into the ground. They can put them in pots, and they don't have to bring them inside and protect them in the winter months. The biggest mistake, like Matt talked about, is people overreacting to winter coming in zone 6 through 9 and putting them somewhere where they don't get natural water. And then those plants dry out too much during the winter because they need water during the winter months, just like they need during the summer months. And we see that so often here at MrMaple. But in zones 5, there's some easy steps that you can do that can really help you grow your Japanese maples during those winter months. One of the first things is when it starts getting to be those colder temperatures. We're talking it starts getting to below zero. It starts getting down to that 10-degree range, down to zero. You're going to need to bring those plants in when it starts going to those extreme temperatures. And you're going to want to put these somewhere that's like an unheated space, somewhere like a shed or a garage. We don't want to get them too hot and too activated because that will actually cause more harm than good.
So typically our target temperatures, and these are generalizations, but we want to keep it above the 20s, but below the 40s, so we're not activating that tree. That's kind of that sweet spot where you can keep a tree a lot happier, and it's not staying too cold or too hot. The main thing we don't want to do in that zone 5 is give this tree a false spring and leaf it out, then take it back out into conditions that are too cold. And I talk about this in our How to Grow Japanese Maples, but Japanese maples are pretty tricky indoors. So if you're going to be in the natural home setting, you know, what zone is your indoors? Like my wife likes it a lot warmer than I do. I keep it pretty cold, right? I think that's pretty common for most people. Well, with Japanese maples, you know, that house may be a zone 4. It may be a zone 11, right? So it's not really going to work for it indoors. The trees need that dormancy period. They need that time to drop leaf and to have that recovery time. It's actually great for Japanese maples to be dormant. Keeping them consistently in leaf is something that stresses them out. So, you know, I'll see people that have one sitting on a dryer inside and they'll say, you know, my tree doesn't look so good. And I'm like, well, that's because it's in leaf and it's January. Like we need this tree to go dormant. We need it to have a good dormancy period. And indoors can be very tricky. So I always let people know that if you're going to keep it in a zone 5 setting and you're going to have to bring that one in a container, again, in the ground, they're going to work great in zone 5. Leave them outdoors in the ground. Indoors, you're going to have to be cautious of not keeping it too warm and too active, especially if you're not putting it in a shed or an unheated garage. Now, water's a factor. So Japanese maples out of leaf are still going to need water. I definitely recommending at least 2 to 3 times a month, even out of leaf.
Like Matt mentioned, Japanese maples need dormancy. If you're just bringing them into a heated space, 60 to 70 degrees is a zone 13. Japanese maples work good zones 5 through 9.
Right.
If you're bringing them into a zone 13, they're not going to survive and do well. So you got to make sure that you put these plants in those unheated garages, in those spaces in a zone 5 where they're not getting that additional heat. And by doing that, you can keep them dormant. But one of the main things you got to worry about when you do this is watering. I think watering during the winter months in zone 5 in those unheated spaces, it's more tricky. I mean, it's always easier just to go ahead and plant that tree in the ground if the ground's not frozen.
Right.
But it's one of the most tricky things, and it's really not that tricky, but that's where we see people make the most mistakes, is trying to overwater or not water at all during those winter months.
I tell people all the time in zone 6 through 9, you know, they don't want to plant their Japanese maple now. Maybe they're moving, maybe they're non-committal to the spot they're planting it in. Maybe they're redoing a garden and they want to put it in a specific spot, but they've ordered a tree, they've got it in February, and they don't want to put it, you know, specifically in that spot. Plant that pot in the ground. Zone 6 through 9, that's going to be a really easy way to overwinter your Japanese maples, just putting the pot in the ground. Now, you don't want to forget it because those roots are going to grow through the drain holes, so it's not something that's a long-term fix. But for a half year or a year, it's a great way to get a Japanese maple in the ground, so you're not having to worry about a lot of these other things. It's going to be drying out at a much more natural pace. It's going to be, you know, having some insulation there from the ground that's actually going to insulate that root ball. And you're just going to have better success with it that way versus bringing it in. A lot of people bring their Japanese maples in zone 6 through 9, and I don't recommend that at all. Protect during the extreme changes. Now, you're going to need to bring them in if you're having a polar vortex or you're having a late frost. We'll get into some more of those things. But if you're having extreme changes in weather, it's always better to prepare for that. That said, oftentimes people will do it all winter, and that one little step is better for a week than the entire winter.
And there's so many things that people overdo in zones 6 through 9. I mean, we talked a little bit about them trying to bring them into the plants, trying to bring the plants inside during the winter in zone 6 through 9. But one of the other things we see that's overdone in zone 6 through 9 is people wrapping the trunks with burlap.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is something to do in extreme changes, like a polar vortex coming through, a cold snap. Not, that's something for a cold snap, but not just for a traditional winter in a zone 6 through 9.
I hear people recommending this in zone 5, for the entire winter. I hear nurseries even recommend this sometimes, and people will do pretty extreme things, like they'll put a tarp over their Japanese maple that may be preventing water. They'll put, burlap around the entire base of the tree. Now, that's going to hold moisture next to the trunk there. It's going to cause undue rot. It's going to open that tree up for bacteria. It's not a good idea for an entire winter. Now, it may make for a good insulation temporarily during an extreme change. And that's one of the things people don't like, because they want to do something and then not look at it again until spring. And the honest answer is that doesn't work. You're going to have to go out there and take care of the tree during extreme changes. So if you know you're having a polar vortex, you're having some abnormalities even in that zone 5 for the winter, that's the time to go out and put the burlap on. And then after those abnormal weather conditions change, you're going to need to go ahead and remove that.
Yeah, because what you're doing with that burlap is you're protecting it from the trunk freezing and splitting, because you're getting crazy weather really quickly that's causing the plant that may have been a little more active to then really have to go through those extreme temperature changes. And by putting that burlap around it, you're protecting it in like a zone 5 during one of those super cold snaps. And that's really protecting it. But if you leave that burlap on there, like Matt talked about, you're going to have fungus. You're going to start opening that plant up to getting bacterial infections. And you cause a lot more problems with your trees in the long term by doing that. I mean, overreactions is one of the biggest problems we see with Japanese maples, is people overreacting to what they have in front of them. And if you're in zone 6 through 9 and you've got a normal winter, you don't have to do a lot. You don't have to do a lot at all. I mean, they're very simple plants. They're very maintenance-free plants, Japanese maples in zone 6 through 9, even in containers. The main thing we have to watch out for, though, in those zones 6 through 9 is people putting those plants during the winter where they're not getting natural water. Like I'll see people bring the pots up next to their house during the winter, which is a smart thing you can do. But if you have
a great way to insulate them.
But if you have an overhanging ledge on your roof that's blocking those plants from getting natural water, then you're starting to cause an issue on those plants that are closest to the house.
Sunrooms might not always be your friend. People bring them into a sunroom because we love to put plants in a sunroom. It may cause, some magnification of heat there. You may get a false spring. So you always want to do things to avoid leafing out too quickly, because it's much harder to maintain a Japanese maple that's leafed out too early than to keep one dormant. So if you can keep that dormancy period until the natural time, that's a way easier way to do it. Now, we actually have cold frames here. So our Japanese maples, a lot of what we grow here at our nursery are in, they're under poly right now during this time of the year. We were stretching poly last week. We were getting that over the Japanese maples. We were actually 26 to 28 last week a little bit. And what we do is, after those extreme changes in temperature, a lot of things are still in leaf, so we're not really quite into winter conditions, but we'll water after those extreme changes. So watering your Japanese maples that you have in containers, even in zone 6 after your colder spells, is a great way to help that tree have some recovery time. It's a great way to, kind of activate that Japanese maple, not activating it to leaf, but activating it to recovery. So you can kind of minimize some damages that may have occurred from those freezes.
Yeah, those cold spells actually take moisture out of your plant, just like the heat does during the summer. So if you're going through and you're watering a plant after a cold spell, you're watering it and it needs it. I mean, that's one thing it really, really needs. And how much do I water during the winter months? I mean, that we run into this topic like crazy whenever it comes to people in zone 5, people in zones in 6 through 9 who are growing them in containers.
And it's going to change a little bit depending on the drought rate. I mean, it depends on how warm it is. It depends on how quickly, how much moisture your area is holding. So it is going to be something you're going to have to check by hand and be maintained.
Yeah. And that's the thing where people try to oversimplify it. And they just want to say, they want us to tell them once a month, once a week. I mean, someone in Texas is going to be watering their plant during the winter more during the winter months than someone in New York. I mean, it's just plain and simple because the plant in those hotter zones may be needing moisture more quickly. But then if the person in New York is getting really cold spells, they're going to need to water as well. And so you just go out there, do that finger test, check and see. The one thing we don't want to do during those winter months is overwater your Japanese maples. Because if you're keeping your plants always wet, during those winter months is when things like Pseudomonas and Phytophthora set up from overwatering your plants. If your plants are too wet, you start to get some root rot, Phytophthora, and Pseudomonas, and that's when those really bad things begin to spread.
Yeah, Japanese maples essentially don't want to be wet and cold. So we like to leave them, I wouldn't say too dry. You want to maintain a happy balance of your Japanese maple having, some moisture there in the soil going into a cold snap, and then after that cold snap, watering them well. That's typically what I recommend. Again, you want to wait till it's above freezing before you're watering again. One, because your water's frozen, obviously, but two, because that Japanese maple will be able to retain more of that water and it'll be able to heal it quicker. So oftentimes, if we've been in the lower 20s here, whenever we get back up above the 35 mark, I'll go ahead and water the nursery very well just to give those plants some recovery time. Now, this next step, it's not something that you're going to be doing in the winter months, but it's one of the most important things to the success of your Japanese maples in the winter months. And that's not over fertilizing. We talk about this a lot at our nursery. Some people probably hear us say this a lot, think we're beating a dead horse, but it's so important. You don't want your Japanese maples staying too active. So those fertilizer times are very important. We recommend fertilizing your Japanese maples in early spring. In zone 5, definitely don't over fertilize. You're going to be activating your tree at the wrong times. You don't want to be going too much. Moderation is your key with fertilizing Japanese maples. We cut off any fertilization here at our nursery in late May. And the reason we do that is because we want those trees to be shut down. We want them to go through their dormancy period and be very healthy and happy going through those winter months. And if you can do that, you will have less of that trunk splitting during extreme freezes.
Yeah, I think that's a key important thing for Japanese maples, healthy during the winter months, is just making sure that your plants are shut down, that your plants aren't still being active during the winter months when the plant should naturally be dormant. I mean, when you give the fertilizer too late or you over fertilize, you're keeping those roots and the xylem flow too active on the plants. Even if the leaves have dropped, you can still have the bark splitting because the bark is too active. The xylem flow is too active. The arteries of the plant are too active during those winter months. And by making sure that you shut off that fertilizer, you can avoid that because that's what the plant naturally does. It naturally goes dormant during the winter months unless you throw fertilizer during the wrong time of the season or over fertilize.
I'll throw out the same thing here. We talked about this in how to grow, but you don't want to be pruning in the winter months because you can activate the tree. The sap's going to be higher in the tree after pruning. So you don't want to be pruning going into extreme cold changes. I typically prune here in mid to late March because we're past a lot of our extreme changes and our trees are starting to activate. We're right before we leaf out. That's the best time to prune because your Japanese maple isn't going to be actively pushing sap and open for some of those cold snaps as well. So if you can do those things in zone 6 and 5, you're going to have much better success, not over activating them. Those things may be a little bit more forgiving in some of those hotter zones. I mean, I hear people doing, all kinds of things in zone 8, and it may be a little bit more forgiving. It's still the ideal time to do it, but essentially, don't be over fertilizing and over trimming in the wrong times in zone 6 and 5.
Yeah, that's really important. And when we're talking about, what Matt's talking about is those late winter and early spring is really the time to prune your Japanese maples for shape, to prune them to really promote growth. The early winter to midwinter is the time you don't want to do it. I mean, the plants are taking, a long time to heal during those times, where in the late winter to early spring, they heal really quickly. And when you're pruning, you're making an open wound on the plant for it to heal back again. And we want that to heal as quickly and effectively as possible. And if you do that in the late winter to early spring, that's really the ideal time for pruning your Japanese maples, not the early winter to midwinter.
Now we're here in zone 6, so our trees are good and dormant But one thing to be considerate of if you're bringing trees in, that they go through an acclimation period a little bit through your winter. If you're in a heavy cold zone, you don't want to put a tree out that's come from a heavy zone 8 in a zone 5 winter. With us, all of our trees are actually good and dormant. We take all these steps to maintain that they've shut down thoroughly and that they're not active during those winter months. So getting into our next topic is, can I plant in the winter? That's a topic that a lot of people are going to ask. It could be a little different for zone 5 and zone 6 through 9. It's actually something that you can plant any time of the year when the ground's not frozen. And a lot of those zone 5 people, I would definitely recommend getting your container even in the ground if you're not going to be fully committed in planting.
And in those zone 5 places too, if you don't have a plant, if you can't put it in the ground physically and you don't have a garage or something to put it in, something we didn't bring up earlier is you can always mulch the container. I mean, you can mulch all around the container to insulate the container, so it's like it's in the ground. And that's a great way to overwinter your Japanese maple outside in the natural water setting, so that plant can go through the dormancy periods just like the trees that are in the ground, but still be in the container.
Just be very conscious of that false spring. People bring them in, activate them, especially in that zone 6, and that's a trickier thing. Oftentimes, it's almost easier sometimes for the zone 5 people to plant in spring because you get acclimated and rooted in, and then you're ready for that winter habit. You can plant a Japanese maple anytime when the ground's not frozen. I always like to let people know that anytime when the ground's not frozen is a great time to be planting. But zone 5 people, sometimes planting in the early spring gives you that whole year of root growth getting set in before that fall can get kind of cooler a little bit quicker than us here. And, you can plant fall. We end up planting midsummer half the time. We plant a lot during the winter here.
If you can dig a hole, that's a season you can plant a Japanese maple. I mean, that's why we're talking about you can plant a Japanese maple anytime the ground isn't frozen so much that you can't dig a hole. If you physically can't dig the hole, there's no way you can put a Japanese maple in the ground. But if you can dig a hole, then the Japanese maple it's a great time you can plant the Japanese maple. And the Japanese maple's roots will be insulated in the ground. The one thing that some people do, though, when they're planting Japanese maples, and you got to be careful about this in the late fall to early winter, is digging a huge hole for a small Japanese maple and then filling it with something like pine bark, which is a very open, airy substance. It can almost be like having a container out there because that pine bark doesn't get to the same temperature as the root soil.
Right. It can freeze dry sometimes too because it's staying too wicked away. We're pulling all the moisture away before a heavy freeze. So you got to be careful about freeze drying. Heavy freezes are inevitable. I mean, that's something that's always going to happen if you're in some of these cooler zones like us. We're going to get some heavy freezes this winter, and it's natural. It's not something you have to overly compensate for. I mean, there's going to be some cold spells. That's called winter, right?
Yeah, winter's always going to happen. We're always going to have some variation in the temperature during the winter months. The time when you have to worry about it is when the plants start to get really, really hot and you've had some really warm weather, and then there's that cold snap, which means that it's going to drop drastically in temperature to a part of that the plant's just not used to. I mean, it's those irregular weather patterns. We're not talking about regular weather patterns where the plant's 32 degrees at night.
Right.
We're talking about when it's been 70 degrees and then all of a sudden it's going to be 14 degrees. I mean, those extreme changes, that's what a cold snap is. And that's when you really have to take those extra steps to protect your Japanese maples during the winter months.
So JD Vertrees says Japanese maples are good in the ground down to negative 24. And these are your typical palmatums grafted onto palmatums. The thing to maintain there is that true dormancy. You don't want to be activating a tree. You don't want a false spring. The times we have to protect the most are when a tree has stayed too warm. We've had a warm winter. We've had a lot of active days. It's not uncommon for us here to get some really warm days in February. And so we're very cautious after that to be careful not to protect our plants that may have gotten a little bit more active.
And with Japanese maples, when we're talking about zones 5 through 9, that's most Acer palmatum, most Acer shirasalonum, and most Acer japonicums. Whenever we're talking about some varieties, like some of the coral bark varieties, those varieties that have those winter interest, most of those are going to be in those zones 6 through 9 categories. So if you're in a zone 5 and you're wanting to grow some of those, it may be best to grow those in a container and then something that you can bring in and protect during the winter months. So keep that in mind. Most of the coral bark varieties are going to be a zone 6 through 9, where most of your other Japanese maples are going to be in that zones 5 through 9 setting for hardiness zones.
Yeah, you're going to need to protect from extreme changes. Anytime when the Japanese maples are going from an active setting to a heavy freeze, that's at your most dangerous time. That's the time when the most damage is likely to occur. You'll see Japanese maples oftentimes a few years later, people will say, I don't know what happened to this Japanese maple. It looks like it exploded from within. There's this bark splitting right here, and I just don't know what's happening. And people normally notice it during those extreme heats of summer. What's actually happened is that Japanese maple's been too active. Someone's pruned it really heavy during a warm snap, and it's gotten very active, and then we went back into a cold snap, and it split that trunk a little bit. And that damage might not have been as noticeable for a few years because it was below that cambium layer. It was in that bark. And they didn't really notice it on their older Japanese maple until that extreme heat set in. And it was really cold damage. It may have been fertilizer. It may have been pruning at the wrong times. But those things have led to a splitting of the trunk that has led to more issues down the road. Now, we can get into that on a later topic about how to treat for some of those things. But you've got a whole nother set of problems. The best thing to do is to try to avoid that by not getting anything to activate your tree before a heavy freeze.
And when you grow a Japanese maple responsibly, you grow a Japanese maple with fertilizing during the right time of the season. You grow a Japanese maple and you don't prune on it in the wrong times, like the late fall, early winter time period. You can have a Japanese maple that's going to be very maintenance free. I mean, it's simply making the wrong mistakes, fertilizing too often that often causes these, unless you've got a really bad cold snap coming in something like a zone 5. And in those really bad cold snaps, you do need to take extra measures to protect your Japanese maples in those extreme temperature changes. That's when the burlap might be a good idea. Mm-hmm. The tarps you got to watch out for, because what often happens is someone tarps their Japanese maple to protect them from the cold, and then all of a sudden you've got a huge snow load that comes in during the same time, a huge heavy amount of snowfall, and then you're crushing your Japanese maple.
Where that snow would have naturally insulated that plant. The snow is actually great in some of those colder zones because it provides a lot of insulation.
Yeah, and that's the mistake that we see so often. They're like, my tree got squashed, and they send us photos, and they've got a tarp on their Japanese maple covered in snow, and it's like, that snow was good for the plant. that snow is going to be protecting the plant, doing the same thing you wanted that tarp to do. Mm-hmm. But it's nature's way of doing that and protecting your Japanese maple from that extreme cold temperature. And yet you've turned it into a negative by adding that tarp there, where the load fell on the Japanese maple rather than being able to insulate it all the way around.
Yeah, no, insulation works great. I try to avoid plastics. Anytime you can stick with cloth insulation, you're going to have less moisture problems. And again, those things are going to be temporary. You're going to have to go in and put that on before an extreme change and then remove it. One great thing for you folks in heavy zone 5 and like Chicago or some of those areas, Japanese maples don't care about the wind chill. So the wind chill matters for us humans, but it doesn't matter as much for plants. So those extreme wind chill temperatures don't matter as much as the true temperature for a plant. You're going to be looking at what those true temperatures are and protecting during extreme drops in that true temperature. Typically anywhere around 0, we start protecting, but that negative 10 is really where you have to watch out.
Now with Japanese maples, they're extremely easy to grow. They're very, very maintenance-free plants. Just the thing we just want to do is making sure if you do have those temperature extremes like we talked about with cold snaps, the main thing is as soon as that temperature changes, as soon as that cold snap is passed, you remove what you did to protect it during that cold snap. People often forget, leave it on there way too long, and that's where we see all the mistakes. That's where we see fungus. That's where we start to see all these other issues from that protection. Because that protection is good, but it's only good during the cold snap. Once that cold snap is passed, you got to remove it immediately.
We start protecting in our nursery here anytime we've gotten active and then below about 25. That's typically our number where we start trying to provide more protection for the plants, especially in that early spring time frame. If we can go out and cover them with bed sheets from an extreme freeze just to provide a little bit more insulation. Now, one thing I'd like to talk about here during this part are grow lamps. Be very careful with grow lamps. I have a lot of people that will bring their Japanese maples indoors and put them in front of a grow lamp. you're going to get a zone 11 really fast under a grow lamp. Grow lamps really don't work for Japanese maples. I've had people, put a grow lamp under a pot and cook a Japanese maple. You got to be careful that what you're doing isn't becoming more of the issue than the natural setting. So Japanese maples that are active, you may put a pot over them or something, but that's going to provide its own challenges in the sunlight. Again, I like cloths a lot better than plastics because plastics can heat up in the sun and they can actually activate that tree. So one of the things we definitely don't recommend doing are plastic bags. Oftentimes somebody will put a plastic bag around a Japanese maple with the best of intentions, a trash bag or something like that around a small plant. But that sunlight, with that moisture inside there, it's going to condensate a little bit, especially if it's a cooler winter, we're getting some snow. Trash bags will hold moisture up against the plant, and then that excess heat from that magnified heat from that plastic is going to activate the plant. So we're going to get the tree doing exactly the opposite of what we want with plastics a lot of times. We're going to activate it, and we're going to cause way more damages than if we had left the tree naturally outside or covered in a cloth that added some insulation, but not necessarily that added heat.
Now, during these winter months, Japanese maples are fine outside in zones 5 through 9 in the ground during most temperatures. I mean, they're extremely hardy plants. People often say, oh, we've got a frost coming up. Should I protect my Japanese maple? And you're going into fall. I mean, it's going into fall, going into early winter. Mm-hmm. That's when the plant naturally should be getting those cold temperatures. Right. So there's no reason to protect it and try to keep it from the natural weather when that's what that plant is supposed to be doing.
And their native habitat in Japan, they're going to be encountering frost and leaf and starting to go dormant after that fall color. And that's perfectly natural. So you want your tree shutting down. A good frost before your first heavy freeze is actually a great thing. It's going to set that dormancy up for its best success. And so that's ideal. You actually get a few frosts and you get cooler gradually, then you get into your dormancy. And so what you don't want to be doing is anything to encourage activation during that time.
And during that time, you don't want to discourage them going into their dormancy period. I mean, people often will start trying to protect their plants. And you'll see it on the news when they say, protect your plants, we're going to have a frost. They're talking about people's mums. Mm-hmm. Mums are supposed to look very pretty during the fall. Right. And if you don't protect their blooms don't look good. Japanese maples can even get some good fall color during a frost. Mm-hmm. We've had plenty of frost here already, and we're starting to really get some fall color on Japanese maples on their leaves. And the frost isn't something that's hurting the plant. Mm-hmm. I mean, what the frost is doing is it's setting that plant up to start going dormant. It's really sometimes peaks up some of the fall colors during this time of the year, but it's setting that plant to go dormant so that plant is dormant during the extreme weather changes that come later on in the season.
Now, that's going into the fall. Now, at the end of that winter, you're going to need to protect from frost. We typically recommend bed sheets. They're a great way to cover trees in early spring, late winter. It depends on really when you're encountering this. I mean, we can get pretty warm, active winters here at the end of our winters here in western North Carolina. So we're always trying to be preemptive if we're going to have a heavy frost. We have a very mature garden here at MrMaple. We have some trees that are over 30 years in the ground. Some are much older than that, over 50 years in the ground. But most of the trees at our parents' garden are over 30 years in the ground. And we'll prepare to cover trees if we're going into a late frost. Once the trees are very active, that means those leaves are fully out. If those leaves haven't fully emerged yet, there's really not a lot of need to prepare. Like there's a lot, Dad always says the leaves have some antifreeze in them. And I don't know if that's true, but there's a lot of good things going on in that early spring. Japanese maples can actually handle a good bit. It's not uncommon for us to get a frost here, once we're completely in leaf. And we have open house here every Memorial Day and people don't notice at all because our trees have recovered. We've watered them well and they look amazing in just a few weeks after the frost. Now, an extreme frost or an extreme freeze late, those are the things you're going to take extra steps for.
Yeah, in those early spring, late winter settings, when your plant is already activated, that's when you got to protect from a frost. When that plant's already pushing new growth, we're not talking about if those buds are closed up. We're talking about if those buds are opened up into leaves. That's when you start to have a little bit of time that you need to protect from frost. And everyone's frost isn't always equal. Some people have light frost, then there are heavy frosts. You can see this on your windshield sometimes because sometimes it'll be real easy to come off your windshield. And then sometimes if you're out there, you really have to scrape. when you really have to scrape, that can be a hard frost. And if you've got those in the early spring and your plants are very active, that's when it does the most damage. So that's when you'd want to go out and protect it with bed sheets. I mean, bed sheets are some of our best friends during those times if we have that. And if you have a really high wind, sometimes even those times when you would have had a heavy frost, the conditions aren't right to create those heavy frosts.
Yeah, winds are great, actually. Winds are always your friend in that early spring. A little bit of wind can break up those conditions and not let that frost lay down. So I actually love when I'm seeing a cold spell, if there's a little bit of wind going on, that's going to be to our favor as gardeners. The key there, again, don't cover with polys, don't cover with things that are going to create heat. Sun versus shade. Now, trees that are even in a light shade are typically going to leaf out later. That can be even, dappled light from high oak canopies that aren't in leaf. So trees that are experiencing more shade are going to typically leaf out a little bit later. Trees that are in heavy sun conditions, that root ball is typically going to get a little bit warmer. So we have to be a little bit more protective. Sometimes with Japanese maples that leaf out early, something like Katsura we know is an early leafer. If you have that in a heavy sun condition, that's going to be the one to prepare for and to watch a little bit more, especially if it's in a lot of sunlight, because it's going to be earlier on to leaf.
So the other thing to talk about with that too is people in zones 6 through 9 in containers. Your containers are going to leaf out quicker than your plants in the ground. And the reason that is because your soil temperature on those roots is going to be higher in the early spring than the soil temperature on the roots of your Japanese maples that are in the ground.
Our 1 gallons are always the first thing to leaf here at the nursery because that root temperature is higher than even the 7 gallons.
And that's exactly what happens is that those trees in your containers are going to leaf out a little bit earlier in the spring. So keep that in mind that while you have a Tamukiyama in the ground, the Tamukiyama in the container will leaf out much quicker. And you may actually need to protect your Japanese maples from frost that are in the containers more than you need to do the ones that are in the ground because they're more active during those early spring, late winter months when those frosts are coming in.
Now, oftentimes the easiest thing to do is, hey, you're already getting active, grab that container, bring it inside, bring it in the garage, protect it from that frost if possible. A lot of us collectors have several hundred, so it does require some bed sheets. If you've got several hundred trees and containers outside your house, it's something to be cautious of. And just have steps, have some preemptive steps in place. Collect some bed sheets. It's going to be a lot like frost cloth. We have frost cloth here at our nursery, so we'll roll out hundreds of yards of this stuff if we need. But I always want to invent like a big bubble that just goes over the whole garden for that early spring.
What's the absolute worst condition for those early spring, late winter frosts is when you have heavy winds in the early morning, like 2, 3 a.m. And then right as the sun is coming up when that frost is going to be setting, that's still. Because then you get the heaviest frost and it can blow off some of your sheets. And so you have to be careful how you put down your bed sheets around your plants. But at the same time, make sure that they're on there sturdy because sometimes when we have these frosts, you've got cold weather in the morning and a little bit warmer during the day. And when you have those temperature changes, you do have wind. And wind is a good thing like we talked about before. Yeah. But if it's blowing off your bed sheets and then it gets down to a low mile per hour where the heavy frost can set in, that's where I think we've had some of our worst spring interactions with frost.
For sure. And during this stage, I'd also like to recommend, especially for the home gardener, I don't recommend the sprinkler as a frost preventative. No. A lot of times you're adding more moisture to, when you're in leaf, especially juvenile Japanese maples in leaf, you're adding more moisture there. And it's such a detailed thing to keep account of. I know a lot of nurseries will have these massive sprinkler systems they can throw on and create kind of a frost shield with. And that may work in some areas, but I actually don't recommend it for the home gardener. I think it's a little too tricky, and it's actually introducing another factor in that can be more dangerous.
What often happens is people add moisture to the situation when there wasn't enough moisture already, and they may turn what's a light frost into a heavy frost by the temperature that's out there. And you may have gotten away with the moisture not settling on the leaves from the wind, but by adding moisture to the situation and then moving on and trying to water the leaves in different places, you're actually creating a heavy frost. And I've seen people so many times say, well, apple farmers do it. Why can't we? And that seems like good logic, but don't do it. I mean, people try to do it all the time, and they make the situation so much worse with your Japanese maples. Don't set up the sprinkler. Don't go out there and try to water down your Japanese maples when these frosts are happening, because you can definitely create a much worse situation that can really damage your Japanese maples and make them to start to struggle in the early spring.
So winter is often a great time for transplanting. You don't want to transplant Japanese maples when they're in leaf. So let's talk a little bit about transplanting Japanese maples. Now, the time frame I typically recommend is as late as you can go while it's still cold. So I like to go into that February time frame. For us, we're here in Western North Carolina. I always let people know you can adjust your time frames accordingly. We typically leaf out that second or third week in March. That's typically, there's some averages of where we've been in leaf the 1st of March, but in general, we're typically 2 weeks into March before we start really breaking dormancy here outside. And I like to transplant in late February. That way, the trees aren't in leaf, but you're right before your highest rejuvenative stage. So you're going to set yourself up for the highest amount of forgiveness for transplanting.
If your buds are swelling, you're still good to transplant. If your buds have broken, it's too late. If your buds have broken open and small leaves are starting to appear, it's too late in the season to transplant.
You're going to have too much transpiration at this point.
Exactly. But if your Japanese maples are still dormant, excellent time in that late winter season to move your Japanese maple from one spot in the ground to another spot in the ground or to a container. People do this in the wrong time of the season, and we always discourage people from transplanting their Japanese maples during the spring, during the summer, and even during the early fall, because Japanese maples have a lot of white roots, and when they have white roots that are around and they've got that soft, fresh new growth, if you move a Japanese maple during that time of the season, you disturb those white roots, that soft new growth just goes wilty. And then all of a sudden, sometimes your entire Japanese maple will crash. And we have a lot of people who have a big failure rate of moving Japanese maples that are already in the ground. We're not talking about Japanese maples that are in containers going to the ground. We're talking about that are already in the ground. If you're moving a Japanese maple, the very best time to do that is in those late winter months, early spring, either right before those buds start swelling or when those buds are swelling. Again, if they've broken bud, it's too late in the season to transplant your Japanese maple.
Yeah, just remember you can go container to ground anytime when the ground's not frozen, because you're not going to be disturbing that root ball too much. You only want to disturb the root ball when it's easiest. That's going to give you your best success rate. So that late time frame, I'll go mid to late February here, honestly. There's a lot maybe to transplant, so you got to move something. That's the ideal time. I do still try to keep as much root ball intact as possible when I'm doing that. And you're going to have to plant accordingly. There's no guarantees on this. I mean, you're moving a plant. You want to make sure you check your weather, and you're going to do it during your warmer period. Again, you only want to plant when the ground's not frozen. So you're going to want to plan your transplanting around a warm spell. So if you have a warm spell coming up and you know you can move that, you're going to have some non-frozen ground. Heavy frozen ground is not a good time to transplant. So you're going to have to avoid that because it's going to break up more roots. So that heavy freeze, you're going to have more snappage. You're going to have more breakage if that Japanese maple is coming out of the soil in a heavy frozen condition. And you can maintain that root ball. I actually recommend, if you're going to transplant, to take a spade and stamp out your root ball, a couple times throughout the year before starting to transplant, and that'll give you a more defined root ball too. So you'll kind of go ahead and start to already shrink that root ball down and maintain it so that when you do transplant it, you're disturbing less stuff.
Again, the reason we're telling you this is the very best time of the season to transplant your Japanese maple isn't because you can't transplant during the other time and have success. If you do it 9 times out of 10 during the other time of the season, you may fail. But there is that one time out of 10 that you may succeed. So if you have to, there's some times where you have to do it. And we may at some point do a whole video on if you have to move Japanese maples during the wrong time of the year, what you should do.
Right.
But you don't want to transplant a Japanese maple during the wrong time of the season. You're going to have your very best success doing it in this late spring, early winter time period. Because when you transplant a Japanese maple during this time of the season, it's going to be the other way around. You're going to have about 95% success, 5% failure rate. It's not common to fail when you're transplanting during this time of the season. Japanese maples, like I've said before, they're very easy plants. They're easy plants to grow, very easy plants to have in your landscape and garden. But people always try to transplant their Japanese maple in the wrong time of the season.
Yeah, it's very simple there. Just maintain those steps and then make sure it's not staying in wet feet when you get it to its new location. Make sure it's got good drainage. You're definitely going to want to transplant when it's above freezing so you can water it in its new location well. And it's way more forgiving if you do it this way. The reason we're recommending it this way is because we just want to give you the best steps for the best success.
This is also the same time of the season when you have your best success in repotting your Japanese maples. And you can have great success in repotting your Japanese maples in a lot of times of the season. But if you're taking extreme measures on repotting,
especially the
bonsai guys, this is the best time for a Japanese maple to go into a bonsai pot. Now, whenever it comes to Japanese maples, there's always an inherent risk of taking any plant to a bonsai. I mean, you're torturing a plant by putting it in a small pot and manipulating the roots. I mean, that's what you're doing. So if you have some failure, in bonsai, that's to be expected. Mm-hmm. But this is the absolute best time to take your Japanese maple and put into a bonsai pot during this time of the season as well.
Yeah, it's never ideal to bare root a Japanese maple, but they're way more forgiving during this time frame. I cringe when I look in some of the garden groups and people are bare rooting their foliage leaf tree in July. And you're like, people recommend this too. And it's like, that's definitely not ideal for a Japanese maple. The transpiration rate's going to be way, way further along. It may work with some plants, and they may be familiar with plants that works with, but Japanese maples don't like that. They don't like those microfibrous roots getting disturbed while they're taking up a lot of energy.
I've heard some bonsai experts talk about certain pines. I don't know exactly which type of pine, but certain pines, they do this during this time of the season. And some of those pines are extremely popular for bonsai. And I think people try to take those same aspects that they use on pine trees and apply them to Japanese maples, and they don't always work. And this is one of those instances. With Japanese maples, you really want those plants to be dormant and starting to be starting in that early time frame. We're talking late winter, early spring. That if you're going to repot a Japanese maple into a bonsai pot, this is the time of the season to do it. That late winter, early spring. And again, if the buds have broken open, it's already too late.
Yeah, and it doesn't even have to be a bonsai pot. So a lot of you guys may be going from container to larger container. You may be trying to keep that root ball small. This is that time of the year when you can take that Japanese maple out of the container, lightly root prune, take out some of the roots, and then keep it in that same size container. So you're essentially creating a bonsai, but just a Japanese maple, it's going to be smaller long term. So this is the time of the year to reduce that root ball, is in that late February, mid to late February, right before, the same times of year when you can transplant, right before that break in dormancy. That's the times when they're most forgiving and you can make the most changes with the best success rate. So let's get into a little bit about what we like about the winter garden and Japanese maples. There's so much to enjoy with Japanese maples in that winter garden. Tim and I are just plant geeks. We end up going inevitably to the J.C. Ralston or some new arboretum we haven't been to before. And there's so many evergreens, and we're like, hey, let's go look at the Japanese maples. And oftentimes we're such geeks that we'll get home and we'll look at those pictures, a year later, and we'll forget that those trees weren't in leaf, because in our minds, we were just appreciating and enjoying those trees so much. We were so excited to see these trees. Something like an Inabashidari, something like an older lace leaf. We get so excited to see these structures that in my mind, I didn't even remember that it was dormant.
That's exactly what I was going to say. How many of y'all listening out there today have went to an arboretum during the winter to go look at Japanese maples, and then later on, when you're looking at the photos, you're like, I thought it was in leaf. Right. And that's because your mind sees that plant for the structure, sees the plant because you know those plants. And by seeing the structure, it's really one of the best times to see how Japanese maples, their habits, how they stand out from the other plants. I mean, it's one of the easiest time to go in and see the shape of a Japanese maple and understand how this one is different from another. During the winter months, when you look at the structures, you can really tell how an orangeola is extremely cascading and a Tamukiyama has an arching habit, but it isn't as pendulous as an orangeola.
Oh, I really enjoy, especially mature specimens out of leaf. I love to go and look at these things and just kind of enjoy their structure and everything. I take offense to the people that are like, hey, you went to go look at some sticks. I'm like, hey, come on now. I really appreciate these things for what they are. Like, I even take offense to like they're only three seasons of interest. I'm like, these things are really cool structurally there in the garden. There's plants that aren't even lace leaves, like Mokawi etsubusa, that just give you so much structure there in the winter garden. They're so interesting. I mean, it almost looks, architecturally so interesting on its own.
And the other thing that this allows you to see is you really can see the bark of the Japanese maples.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you something like a nanyat, where you see the leaves that provide such unique interest with the texture, or something like a sengukaku that has some really nice green foliage, some good yellow fall color, when those leaves drop and you can see that bark color, you can see the green bark, you can see the brown barks, but then you can see some of those coral bark types. Like you bring in some of the yellows, some of the greens, some of the oranges, some of the reds. I mean, that's when you see Japanese maples with those winter interests that you couldn't see if they still had leaves on them.
It's I've said it a lot, but especially with coral bark Japanese maples, my favorite time of the year is when they're out of leaf. Now that may sound crazy to a lot of folks because you get such a great spring color and fall color with these, but I love when they're that spark of color in that winter garden. A lot is already out of leaf. A lot of us as gardeners may not have things that are just really drawing the eye in. I think they steal the show, even in a heavy evergreen conifer garden. That deciduous spark, but that bark, it really just lights up. It's that highlighter in the garden, those sangukakus, those surdamens, those bihu, those wildfires, those gold diggers. They're so interesting in those winter months. They really show out. It's really their time to shine. Everything else in the garden kind of takes a step back, and those coral bark Japanese maples, that's their season.
Now, when it comes to other Japanese maples, it's one of the things during those winter months when you can see those structures, you can see those bare bones. That is one of the reasons why it's also so good to prune and shape during those winter months, because you don't have the leaves obstructing the branches, so you can see what shapes you like better while those leaves are off. It's so much easier to prune your Japanese maple in that late spring or that late winter, early spring time frame when those leaves are off, because you can actually see the structure, you can see the bones of the plant to really make the adjustments that you want to make.
Yeah, we try to do that right before we leaf. Again, our leaf times can change here a good bit. If it's a really late season, I try to go 2 to 3 weeks before we're breaking bud. I'll go out there and check the buds out, and that's when they're at their highest rejuvenative stage. And do be conscious that pruning them is going to make them leaf out a little bit. So you don't want to prune them if you have a huge cold snap coming in. Be conscious of those things because you can activate your tree. But that's the time frame when they're going to heal so much quicker. I try to avoid that early winter pruning. I just think you're activating your tree at the wrong time. Your healing time frame is going to be so much longer, and you're opening the tree up for bacteria, insects that may be looking to hide somewhere for the winter. You're creating a place, a source for animals that are going to look at this plant differently when it's active versus if it's completely shut down. Insects are going to be looking way more for that sap and things like that during that time of the year. So let your tree completely shut down. Let it go through all these stages. And then as we're getting into spring, right at that late winter, early spring stage, that's when you want to do your pruning.
This is one of the things that I love so much about Japanese maples, though. The fact that they go dormant allows me to be so excited when spring comes. I mean, if it wasn't,
conifer guys don't have any patience.
If it wasn't for these winter months when the plant did not have leaves, I wouldn't be so excited when this plant begins to put on spring new growth. And the plants need that rest during the winter so that they can then put on these amazing colors. I mean, I guess it takes a lot of work to be pretty. And they need this rest period. They need the sleep period for them to then put on these leaves. And it's one of the things I enjoy the most about Japanese maples is the changes of the seasons. When we can look at the leaves in the spring, we can look at the leaves during the summer, we can look at the leaves in the fall, and then we can look at the structures of the plant and the bark during the winter. I mean, it's this ever-changing beauty that makes Japanese maples so amazing. And if it wasn't for these winter months, we wouldn't have the rest.
I think if you're a gardener, you have to be an optimist. There's something about that. It's that dream of spring. It's that anticipation of spring. It's just so much fun. And I think there's a buildup to that. There's so much fun waiting on those first trees to leaf out after that long winter, your anticipation of that spring foliage, and just it's an optimistic time of the year. There's nothing more fun than when the Japanese maples first start to leaf out for us here at our nursery. That's like, that's really the best time of the year here at the nursery is when everything's just starting. It's that beginning to spring. You're through the winter, and things are really at their peak. I mean, the next few weeks. So it's that optimistic time of the year for gardeners. And I like that anticipation of it. I think Japanese maples provide that for gardeners. It's that we're gardening all winter, but we know that spring's coming.
Japanese maples are one of they're my favorite plant. And these winter times give you such a great time to do so much with your Japanese maples. When we're from talking about this is a time to plant, transplant, repot, and it's such a great time to be able to enjoy these plants in a very unique way.
Oh yeah, this is when all the prep work's done. If you've done everything else right on the timing, this is when then you're going to sit back in spring and just enjoy your trees. They're fertilized in that late time frame. They're pruned. They're ready to leaf out and look their best. And it's really that prep work that goes into making the spring and the fall the best part.
I hope you all have enjoyed this video on winter is coming. What to do with your Japanese maples during the winter. Because there's a lot to do during the winter to really make the most out of your Japanese maples, and a lot to do and what not to do when it comes to Japanese maples in the winter.
Hey, thanks for listening to us, guys. Again, you can subscribe on all major platforms. We really appreciate that. We've been really trying to get these podcasts out to you weekly. We've been hitting that. We have some incredible interviews lined up. We've got some really fun guests coming in. So this next week, Tim and I will be going into the Maple Society meeting. We'll be talking to some more people there about being podcast participants here. So we've got some really fun stuff there set up with you. And I think you're really going to enjoy this. We plan on just taking it further and further. So there's so much going on here with this podcast. And again, you can always catch, Tim said watch. Most of our people are listeners that are probably listening to us on the podcast platforms. But you can always watch the video component that goes with this. Those air every Sunday night at 8 p.m. on the MrMaple Show. So make sure to sub us on the MrMaple Show. But definitely be looking us up on all these podcast platforms.
If you're cooking dinner, you can literally say, "Hey, Alexa, play the MrMaple podcast." And Alexa will bring it up on Amazon Music and start playing the MrMaple podcast. I thought that was one of the coolest things. My wife was like, "Is that y'all?" I was like, "Yes, honey. Alexa knows where we're at, knows how to play our podcast." So it was pretty exciting stuff. I'm so excited about the podcast and the future of the podcast, the things we can cover, the people we can interview, and the topics we can cover to help people garden with Japanese maples.
Hey, special shout out to Sean Richardson of Bad Rabbit. He makes us sound good, gets our audio looking good, and our video made every week. We really appreciate that. We've been having just so much fun doing this. So there's so much more that we want to do. Again, on this show, the content we provide is the content we want to see. So we want to keep making that. So we greatly appreciate your support, whether it's shopping on MrMaple or just subbing us on one of these channels. We greatly appreciate you guys tuning in.
Take care.
God bless.
And have an awesome day.